Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, given the circumstances of the past few weeks, I'm delighted that my guest this week is Peter Bleksley. He is a former detective at Scotland Yard, and you might have seen him a lot more on the media recently. He's also becoming something of a social commentator. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. In at the deep end, if you like. The wider public confidence in the police has been declining over the past few years. That seems to be undeniable. Do you think it has gone up or gone down in the wake of this disorder we've had over the past few weeks?
Well, I'm sure we'll get some kind of survey before very long, and we'll then be able to judge what those figures are. But in terms of the long-term decline, the rot set in many years ago and has reached, in recent times, catastrophically low levels. And there's a multitude of reasons for this. But essentially, what the police have foolishly done in the last 20 years, and this is by and large due to their senior officers being in the grip of academia. Academia now has got policing by the short and curlies, to be quite frank with you. The demands that every officer needed a degree. All of the senior officers, so many of them are Oxbridge graduates and such like, and they've got masters, and we've got universities with policing departments. We've got doctors and professors of policing. And of course, what so many of them fundamentally fail to appreciate is that most of policing can't be learned in books. You learn it out there on the front line, engaging with the public, catching criminals and the such like. So the tighter the grip that academia has got on policing, the quicker the trust has flown out the window. Of course, there's been catastrophic events in recent years. The appalling kidnap, rape and murder of Sarah Everard, and the capture of another Metropolitan Police officer who I won't even bother to mention the name of, but is the most prolific convicted rapist in the land. Those had a huge effect on public trust, confidence. But in terms of respecting the police turned their back on the moderate mainstream of the UK, whose natural default position is to support the police.
Yeah.
And by that I mean those wonderful, hard-working people who had their houses burgled, their cars stolen or broken into, their phones snatched as they walked around one of the cities in the UK, their bikes stolen so often as they parked it at the railway station to then commute into a city to work very hard, earn money, pay taxes. Their elderly relatives that have been defrauded online because they weren't aware of those shysters that are out there defrauding people in vast numbers. That's really the elephant in the room as far as policing. And of course, those independent shopkeepers and the big brands who now are targeted on a daily basis, and people just walk out of their shops with hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of goods cumulatively and not paying. So once the police turn their backs on that moderate mainstream by not investigating their crimes, not visiting them, not getting to know the victims, not giving them some reassurances, some advice, and making some effort to try and solve those crimes, that had a big impact, I believe, on the moderate mainstream's opinion of the police.
The thing is, take the shoplifting thing, which is something that people experience every day. You see it, not just on social media, you see it happening,
Yeah.
Why? I mean, I know it sounds a crazy question, but was a decision made simply just to ignore these particular crimes?
We can date this back to 2014, when the Crime Policing Courts and Sentencing Bill was passed. I think I've got that title almost right. It's a bit clunky. And what that law said was that any offence of theft under £250 in value could only now be tried in the lower courts, in the magistrates' courts. Because what had happened prior to that is a shoplifter would get arrested with £100 worth of stuff, for example. They would plead not guilty and elect to go to trial at the Crown Court. That was their right. They could do that. That bill in 2014 changed all of that, but somewhere along the line, there was a miscommunication. And many in the media and some in policing read it as, if a shoplifter is caught with less than £250 worth of goods, they won't be prosecuted. That is not what that bill said. It said they will be tried in the lower courts. But some, I think, used it as an excuse to go, well, it's not really important, is it? Well, you try talking to my mate who runs the local news agent and has done for 40 years. You suffer a £200 loss. And that makes a massive, massive dent into his weekly profit or loss margin. Think about it. So that's how it kind of got misconstrued. And when you add to that the lack of deterrence that we now have, and by that I mean, of course, the paltry sentences that are so often handed down, should a shoplifter actually get into court, coupled with the fact that so many stores instruct their security staff to have a non-intervention policy, so they merely watch them walk out the door, adding to that the likelihood of that shoplifter running round the corner and bumping into a police officer who happens to be on patrol, that won't happen. So all those deterrents have disappeared, which is why, sadly, our high streets are becoming increasingly lawless and increasingly unattractive places for shoppers and families to go to.
Do you actually think the police have lost control of the streets?
They've abandoned them because they're in their cars. Now, they will say that is out of necessity because basically the police service has morphed into a kind of social service these days. I was on the front line with Bedfordshire Police for 3 days only 3 or 4 weeks ago. So it's not like I'm a dinosaur who retired from policing a long time ago. Right. That's correct. But I had 3 very enlightening days in the back of police cars on blue lights and two-tones only a few short weeks ago.
How can you tell us a bit about what you got from that?
I saw frontline police officers being everything that the public would want their cops to be. Courageous, professional, compassionate and thoughtful, and desperate to arrest bad people. But unfortunately their workload is, and this was according to their inspector, again a very nice, committed, long-term, long-service police officer, is 70% social work and 30% police work. And when I asked her, well, what can be done to readdress that balance, she was lost for an answer. I think I know what could be done, but that's it. So, I mean, Werner Herzog once wrote that the world declares itself to those who travel on foot. And I actually abide by that, whether I'm on holiday, whether I'm travelling around town, wherever I'm going, I try to walk, because you see, you hear, you speak, you listen. And that, of course, is what policing did. Back in the old days, I know, when officers walked the beat. They did exactly that. They were a visible presence, a visible deterrent. People could engage with them, even if it was just a good morning, sir or madam. And all of that has largely disappeared.
I think I've thought for quite a long time, this term now that is far more widely known of two-tier policing. I've thought there's been two-tier policing in the police for quite some time. Since I was on, I had to scrutinise the police when I was on the London Assembly. It became quite clear to me that I'm thinking of, for example, 2020, the Black Lives Matter protests, where people from the Met, police from the Met took the knee. and all of this, and COVID people were kind of, well, treated pretty, roughed up a bit. But nevertheless, it remained sort of preoccupation of people like me. It seems to me that the recent disorders have really shown that to a lot more people, that in fact there seems to be an entirely different approach.
Well, we know how much the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Mark Rowley, gets irritated by the expression two-tier policing. Yeah. You may have seen him knocking a microphone from a reporter's hand when he asked him the very question about that. Not exactly the sort of actions you would expect from a Met Commissioner. They're very sensitive about it. We're hearing denials in the media all the time. No such thing, which of course is complete nonsense. For over 20 years, I've been speaking about what I used to call inconsistent policing. And there are some understandable inconsistencies within policing. For example, a young officer who's recently come out of training gets called to a situation to deal with two youths who are carrying out some acts of antisocial behaviour. That young, fresh-faced, keen, inexperienced cop might deal with those two youths somewhat differently to how a 25-year service veteran cop might deal with them, both in terms of language, attitude, outcome. One might arrest, one might not. So there's always going to be inconsistencies in policing, and some of those are understandable. But with regards to the big things that grip the headlines that we all see, it is completely understandable for members of the public to see uniformed officers running away from rioters in Hare Hills a few weeks ago, to then seeing police officers in full public order kit, commonly known as riot gear, shields, helmets, flame retardant clothing, running towards protesters and giving them a whack and knocking them over and all of that. Yes, they're inconsistent. The police will argue there was a reason they ran away in Hare Hills, but as a very deep principle, people will say that is two-tier. They're doing one thing in one set of circumstances and another in another set of circumstances that appear to be very similar.
Yeah, but you see, I remember when we talked before on another occasion, actually, Peter, and we were talking about the old idea, Robert Peele principle of policing without fear or favour, which is essentially, impartial policing. That's what it is. Policing by consent. That seems to have disappeared. One thing that worried me about what we've seen over the past few weeks is that when you say that they will deny it and deny it, you've had these instances of police officers actually talking as though they're not doing anything wrong, saying we have been talking to the community about how we should police the situation. And you sort of look at it and say, why are you actually consulting with who are community leaders for a start? But why are you, using that as a guideline for your policing?
As one police officer said very publicly, consulting with elders and community leaders. And of course, that led to virtually an absence of policing in those particular circumstances.
I think it was Birmingham, wasn't it, where the pub was attacked?
And it is very inconsistent, and the public rightfully pick up on this and say, why do we have this two-tier of policing? Well, let's bring it back to the pro-Palestinian marches that we've had in London, so many of them since the 7th of October last year. And it is undeniable that some law breaking on those marches has gone unpunished. People weren't arrested at the time. Units didn't go into the crowd with their, and they're trained to do this. They can go into a crowd, snatch somebody, in essence, who's breaking the law, whether that be for a chant, an offensive banner, whatever that may be, remove them, take them away and charge them. There wasn't any of that. There was some evidence gathering for later prosecutions, but contrast that to how a gathering of people in Whitehall just a few days ago were dealt with, where we saw images of white-faced people being slammed to the floor by people carrying shields, and they then being unceremoniously carted off. That clearly is inconsistent. But I'll tell you why they won't, or they didn't arrest people on those pro-Palestinian marches, and that is a numbers game. Because if it was suddenly to create some enormous great storm that kicked off with thousands of protesters, and then disquiet about that spread perhaps into Muslim communities that perhaps would have an affection or a link to Gaza and the Palestinian cause and all of that, which others may not, the numbers game of the police generally means they wouldn't be able to handle that.
Well, you see, actually, there was a policeman who caught on again on in some ways, thank goodness for social media, actually, because otherwise we wouldn't see these things. More or less saying to people who were standing by during one of those Gaza demonstrations, there are more of them than there are of us. He said it quite clearly. But you see, he was talking their literature and numbers game on that day.
Yeah.
But my perception of it is just, it seemed to me very clear that they had been told to go soft on people because this is a community that might well kick off. You know, now look, that is
all the evidence would seem to back that theory up, wouldn't it? When we contrast it with how other gatherings, other protests by people with different political leanings have been policed, and the language that has come out before them. So it's not only the actions. Look at the language that has been released by the Metropolitan Police in particular. Go back over recent months and look at the language they use prior to any pro-Palestinian march, and then look at the language they use prior to a march that may have been arranged by, dare I say it, Tommy Robinson, for example. The language is different.
Well, I mean, first of all, you know, I remember again when I was on the Assembly, it was just quite clear that, for example, in 2020, when you had groups of basically white guys coming down as a counter-protest, essentially to look after the statues as they saw it, right? They were immediately going to be far right from the very, very beginning, right? I would say that anyone who protests along those lines is going to be called far right now. That seems obvious to me. But we've had situations during those demonstrations, Peter, where you've had from the river to the sea being, you know, shone on Big Ben, right through to these very strangulated definitions by the Met of what jihad means.
Yes.
You know, now that is managing people, isn't it? That's managing what you might call the non-Muslim community in a way.
Isn't a call for jihad in a striving against moral something or other? Well, you know, we can conveniently apply whatever sort of descriptions we want, I guess. We see those inconsistencies. And if we look, for example, at how about 200 largely white men were kettled on Westminster Bridge, all of them handcuffed, all of them detained for a while, that stood in stark contrast. Now, let's not be truth deniers. There are some idiots, like the rioters, like some of the people that turn up on these marches, that are spoiling for a fight on both sides of the argument. I don't like the broad brush, far right, far left, all that kind of stuff. I think it's lazy labelling, and I think it's by and large used to bracket together huge numbers of people to whom that label does not apply, partly with a view to shutting them down and shutting them up. However, yes, some idiots go there spoiling for a fight. They need to be dealt with robustly. I don't have a problem with robust policing. In fact, I'm a bit of a fan of it, as and when it is necessary and required. I think if you're chanting a genocidal chant calling for the extermination of a whole race or faith followers of people, then I think that needs a bit of robust policing, because if you don't, you are actually appeasing people. And anybody, I should say, most people should understand that appeasement does not end well, because it empowers people. And when they are empowered, they push the boundaries, they behave even worse. And some of those marches had some very, very disrespectful climbing of statues, climbing of memorials, all that kind of stuff, planting flags where they shouldn't have been planted. And that is born out of appeasement, leads to empowerment.
See, the thing is, it goes back a long way. I've heard you speak about this as well, and obviously you know, it goes back a long way. I'm thinking of things such as that terrible press conference that was held with the mother of the little boy who scuffed a Quran. Do you remember?
I do.
It was like almost something out of Soviet Russia. And over the past month or so, we've also seen, policemen sort of, sitting there with all these various Muslim elders around them, and it's sort of almost, people, are utterly perplexed, not just angry at the fact that it seems to be loaded against them. I wanted to, just...
And may I interrupt, Peter, please, if I destroy your thread there, but it needs to be said, using Arabic greetings and Arabic sign-offs when they're speaking down the camera.
I know.
So, in that vein, when there is next, and I hope that's a very long time, if indeed never, there is an attack or a serious crime or disorder, for example, against the Jewish community, and a police officer, senior police officer, needs to address the media, then I trust there will be a greeting and a sign-off in Hebrew. Or else it's inconsistent. It could be called Twotier.
What do you think of Keir Starmer and the government's general response to this?
They stopped the rioting. And that, I think, is a very good thing. Those rioters were idiots. They get what's coming to them, and we've seen that by some of the very swift sentences being handed down. But my thoughts now are, prior to this outbreak of rioting, we had a number of very serious, uncontrollable crime outbreaks, one of which has cost hundreds of lives. And I talk, of course, about the scourge of knife crime, which plagues our nation and has led to the death of hundreds of young people, including children, teenagers and the like. And let's not forget, whilst not talking anything more about Southport because somebody's been charged, we know it's in the public domain, those killings were caused by knife crime. It's out of hand. It's utterly appalling. Likewise, shoplifting, which we've touched upon, and of course, stats only released yesterday about the number of assaults on women on the transport system, let alone on the streets of Britain.
Up 50%, I believe, in a few years.
I have a huge amount of sympathy and a massive amount of irritation about what women in our country are being subjected to. It is utterly appalling. And it strikes very firmly within my soul, because my heroes, my mum, single mum in the 70s, imagine how difficult that was, my sister, my wife, and many other women in my life who are utterly heroic, pioneers in their careers. My wife set up the first ever domestic violence unit in the Metropolitan Police all those years ago. And I could go on about the achievements of the women that I adore and respect and have the pleasure of knowing as friends as well. And now everything that they've fought for, all the progress that they've made, which is absolutely incredible in recent decades, and now they are being assaulted in record numbers, they are being subjected to harassment and abuse in record numbers, and I will not let my wife go anywhere near public transport on her own.
Yeah.
Because it's absolutely appalling. I spend a lot of time in green rooms as I go around making media appearances, for example, within production companies and such like. And so many of the young women that I speak to there tell me about how they have become victims of crime. And when I say to them, did you report it to the police? So often the response is, what's the point? Because they know, in all likelihood, they probably won't get an investigation and therefore the perpetrator won't be caught.
The thing is, though, Peter, is that these figures come out, 50% increase on the cheap, but they're left kind of hanging in the air. One has this sort of strange conversations. I mean, what do you think accounts for it? I have my own ideas, but, I would have thought, and this is entirely speculation, because we simply are not given data, is that there are now in our society thousands of young men from cultures that simply do not respect women. That is one that seems to me as a kind of hunch, if you like.
And I'm sure that is a factor. I also feel that there is some diminishing of the status, the respect, the courtesy and everything that I would afford not only just women but my fellow human beings, and it's all being eroded somehow. And it's very deeply, deeply troubling. But to go back to your question about Starmer, the response to the riots and this, that and the other, the police, the CPS and the courts showed how they could mobilise when it is politically instructed and needs to be expedient. They can do it. For months, for years, we've been hearing about our chronically underperforming criminal justice system in terms of police at the front line, CPS, courts, prisons, probation. Well, funnily enough, 4 out of the 5 were all able to mobilise and lock up a lot of rioters. And there's a lot more to go and serves them right. But if they can do that, then why can the system not mobilise with the same vigour, with the same funding, the same determination to try and tackle the knife crime, the shoplifting and all the violence against women and girls?
And it's interesting is that suddenly there is space in the prisons. Having been told that there's just no space in our prisons and we've got to let people out early, there suddenly is space. It seems to me it's about will, the political will to do something. If that's there, then it can be done.
Yeah.
One thing that I think to me is really, really important is sort of connected to this, but not in a way. That is that there is going to be, it seems to me, a general constriction coming down on certain kinds of speech. I think the government have made that quite clear. But, for example, Peter, there is a new definition coming on the books, almost certainly, of Islamophobia. You would know about this. Talked about it a lot on the channel. It's one that effectively almost rules out any criticism of Islam. Right. I use that as an example. How would the police police something like that?
Well, it's a slippery slope to blasphemy laws, isn't it?
Well, I'd say it is a blasphemy law, but the fact is that I'm using that one as a very, very controversial definition, which probably will end up in the law. But what I mean is, what will the police's role be in that? Will you get police turning up at people's doors much more because of something they've said that is critical of Islam? How would it work? How would the police actually, if you like, enforce it?
I don't have a policing crystal ball, and in this day and age, with that highly educated cohort of senior police officers that I've spoken about, all in the grip of academia, probably asking academics or asking that failing organisation, the College of Police, how they're going to do it, would be the direction that question ought to go towards. Because I can tell you how I think they ought to police it, but they will have their own ideas on how they will do it. But once again, will it be inconsistent? Will you be able to criticise one faith and not another?
Well, of course, that it is specific. I mean, that's the point with this saying, with this new definition, which is actually Islamophobia is rooted in racism. This is how it goes, and in hatred of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It's nonsensical. It doesn't even make sense on its own terms. But all the parties have adopted it except the Tory party. But therefore, it's almost certain that Labour will put it in its, I think it's its Race Equality Act or whatever it might be. I just wonder, because the police have come under such fire, I would say quite rightly, but they are actually only doing what the law, says they should, in turning up, checking people's thinking, as we have with Harry Miller, things like that.
Well, let's just have a rewind to Keir Starmer's very first press conference as the riots kicked off. Now, I know he's talking about riots and behaviour attached to that, but very interestingly for me, he said, we don't need further legislation. I thought that was a bit of a sideswipe at Sir Mark Rowley, the Commissioner of the Met, because Rowley, when Just Stop Oil were performing like idiots, Rowley was saying, we don't have the legislation, we don't have the legislation. Oh, yes, you did have.
Yeah.
You just chose not to enforce it. You chose to allow your officers to get them bottles of water and pizzas and goodness knows what else. And look where that appeasement led to.
Yeah.
The empowerment, and now finally the courts have woken up and they're handing down suitable, punitive punishments to them. That's where appeasement leads to. So if he's talking in the very broadest terms, Starmer, well, if you've got the legislation, why do you need any more? Let's wait and see. There is so much legislation on the statute book now that covers virtually just a myriad of offences. I don't think we need any more. Perhaps we might even need less. But
well, I mean, when you were a policeman, a detective, before we even had the explosion in hate speech laws, really, I guess.
Oh.
And wasn't it actually, it was a pretty good definition of, all free speech was allowed unless it incited violence or murder.
yes.
That seems to me to be pretty all-encompassing, actually. But now we've got all College of Policing stuff,
Yeah.
defining what hatred is.
Yeah. Well, the academics have to do something with their time, don't they? Those academics have got hold of policing. They have to do something with their time. They've got to write papers on something or other.
Yeah.
Whilst knowing nothing about what it's like to be rolling around in the pavement with a robber, burglar or drug dealer.
Do you think, actually, that the police have become, I'm using it as a very broad term, but almost more middle class? They're too middle class in a way. The whole point about our police force was it kind of grew out of the communities that it was meant to be policing, didn't it? I mean, whereas now, as you say, they have to have degrees and everything. They're going to go in with certain kind of concepts and notions anyway, aren't they?
Yes, and they certainly have some of the rank and file. There are fortunately some that are going in not through degree routes at this day and age, but not many. But I speak as a father who's had all three sons go through university. And when they've come out of university, they've known everything. There's nothing I can tell them. They know it all. Needless to say, we've had some lively conversations over the years. And I think there's an element of that in police officers that get their degrees and have their graduations and wear gowns and mortarboards and all that kind of game. I think there is an element of we are, part of the intelligentsia. The other week, I'm talking to a very nice fella, police sergeant. He's got 29 years service in, going to be 30 years early part of next year. And I'm bemoaning the necessity for degrees and the grip of academia on policing. And he turns around and he says, oh, well, actually, I'm doing a master's degree in policing. I says, you've got 29 and a half years service. You've been a sergeant for decades. What on earth do you need to learn about policing? Yeah. And you must be heading for the retirement exit door anyway. So why are you doing it? And he said, oh, well, I need to understand policing in the broader terms. And I said, right, so when you're in the custody suite, right, What broader terms knowledge of policing will help you deal with that prisoner? If you're out on patrol and going to some calls, chance will be a fine thing. What broader terms of policing knowledge do you need to have to once again roll around on the pavement, and so on and so forth? And he couldn't give me an answer. It's a self-indulgent bit of academia, so he can put letters after his name, even fancier letters after his name, whereas really, you know, his time could be better spent, I think, in policing.
Yeah. Well, look, Peter, thank you very much. We actually have a system whereby we ask a couple of questions exclusively for our membership, if you'd stay with me, because,
Of course.
But thank you for joining me today. And it's great to hear such clarity in this situation. So thank you very much, Peter Bleksley. We shall see you next week. Okay, in the meantime, have a good week, won't you? Bye-bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.